Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Donna Rapaccioli, and I have the privilege of serving as the Dean of the Business Faculty and the Dean of the Gabelli School of Business. And I'm really delighted to welcome you all and to also have a chance to participate in some of the day's events. What I heard about yesterday was really wonderful. In fact, Rosemary was just telling me about how wonderful the day went. When I look at what's happening here yesterday and today, it makes me really proud because at Fordham, centers and research centers are really at the heart of our strategy. And this conference really focuses on what makes the way Fordham does centers special. So just give me, for a second, I'll share with you that when I think about centers, I want the center to serve as a bridge to industry, a bridge to government, and a bridge to nonprofits. And if you look at what happened yesterday, we had Microsoft, and today as well, IBM, the City of New York and San Francisco, ACLU, as well as others. The other thing that centers really should do is to bring together academics from across the world. And if you look at what this conference has accomplished, we had people from Utah, Arizona State, Ottawa, University of Connecticut, Princeton, NYU, Fordham, and I'm sure I'm leaving some out. But again, the idea is that it's bringing together diverse thinkers, and from my view, the best way to solve the world's problems is to bring together diverse thinkers. And the last thing that might not strike you as really important, but being a Fordham person, it strikes me as really important, is that this conference involved more than one school and several different centers within the university. So in business and in the world, silos are being broken down, but at Fordham, this is really a historic event because we were able to break down some silos, and we've involved the Urban Law Center, the Center for Law and Information Policy, the Urban Studies Department, the Fordham Urban Law Journal, and the Center for Digital Transformation. So by bringing together partners from industry and government, partners from other academic institutions, and different groups from within Fordham, I think that we've created a really special conference. So one of the things I've learned is that when you open, you should be short. So I'm going to be short, and I'm going to turn the panel over to the experts. So thank you for inviting me, and I look forward to a really exciting day.
So good, is this on? Can you hear me? Yeah. So good morning, I'm Rosemary Wakeman, and I'm a professor of history here at Fordham and the director of the Urban Studies program. So we welcome you this very cold morning, and we are going to start without further ado. This panel is on resident engagement, and really always and ultimately the most creative force in any city is its human or social capital. And this morning, the questions before us and the participants are going to talk about their projects. And one good question for us all is to think about how smart cities and all of this extraordinary technology can open up the possibilities for citizen participation and a more inclusive city. And so with that larger question in mind, without further ado, I'm going to quickly introduce the panel, and the bios are extensive and online for you to take a look at, so I'll leave that to you. So we have Cynthia Farina here with us, Hoy Kong, David Moore. Cynthia and Hoy are going to actually be presenting in tandem, David Moore and Teresa Scassa. And I'm going to open up this panel rather quickly to the audience participation, so pay close attention. There's an exam at the end, and you're going to be asked to pose some very intense questions to the panel. Hoy, I think, is going to begin.
Sure. Perfect. Great. So thank you so much. And thank you to the organizers for putting together such a great conference. This is a project that actually picks up on some of the points that Dean Rapaccioli raised. It's an interdisciplinary project. It's a project that brings together nonprofits, brings together several institutions, and it's funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. It's located in Montreal, which I think might be better known here as Ace Canadian City, of which Rob Ford is not mayor. But I'll just refer to, for present purposes, as Montreal for short. Okay, so here's the problem that the project tries to address, right? It's sort of standard problem in land use and planning processes, right? Citizens, the argument goes in the literature, are typically excluded from meaningful participation in planning processes, right? And what do I mean by meaningful participation? Well, first of all, there are constraints of time, right? So these planning meetings, consultations tend to happen at times where not everyone is able to attend, right? So the paradigm person I have in mind of someone who cannot attend is the single mother who can't afford childcare, right? These things are held in the evenings typically. And so there's just a certain number of people who just can't get there because of constraints of time and resources. Beyond resources of being able to get things like childcare, right? There are different resources involved in the people who do participate, right? Some participants are well-resourced, right, and have plenty of time to devote to planning processes. And they also have a lot of expertise, right? So your average citizen doesn't have expertise, but some participants do have extensive expertise. And we'll just call these people developers, right? So there's a kind of disequilibrium, right? There's certain people who are excluded, right, for reasons of constraints of time, resources, and capacity. So what are some of the challenges, right? So first of all, to go to the questions of constraints of capacity, right, there's a kind of expert layperson gap. So your average person doesn't know the land use regulations, doesn't have a really great background in land use planning, right? And so this is one of the first challenges that we're trying to address. And some of the participants from yesterday talked a little bit about accessibility, but we're talking really in this project about how to make stuff not simply accessible as in it's on the web, right, but understandable. And second, we're trying to find institutions and tools to mediate between citizens and the state, right? That is, how do we find ways to get between the councils, right, and their staffs and your average person? So this is a mouthful, right? We're engaged in place-based action research for engendering meaningful deliberation on local urban affairs, right? And as I said, picking up on Dean Rapaccioli's point, right? We are really working with civil society. So one of the partners of this project is an affordable housing organization, right? And we're working with them to engage in consultations, broad consultations within the borough, in order to address a specific land use project, right? And our idea is that we will provide the council with better citizen participation, better citizen input that they can make use of in their decisions. So our case study is in Montreal's Midtown. It's a large plot of land called the Bellechasse sector, and there is a specific planning tool which allows for specific zoning and control over building types and even expropriation if necessary, right? And so this is what there's a plot of land that's being developed, right? And we are essentially running a kind of parallel process to what the borough is running. So the borough is going through a standard consultation process in which they will put together a plan, they will then present that plan in a public meeting, right? But we're doing a consultation that's far more intensive, right? So we began the project with some exploratory neighborhood walks. So we advertised in the neighborhood, we took our grad students out into the neighborhood, and we asked residents, in partnership with the local affordable housing organization, right, around the site, and asked them things like, what are your concerns around this site, right? We also developed an online questionnaire. We did information sessions about the site and about the planning instrument that was involved. And then we did brainstorming workshops. We went into the community with our graduate students, and we did planning exercises, showed them the site, asked them things that sort of jumped out at them, told them the relative constraints of the zoning instrument, and asked them for ideas and what they thought were priorities. So we did our online questionnaire and asked them sort of what their concerns are, who they were, right? And we developed basically 4 themes, concerns that arose around public space, housing, the character character of the neighborhood, physical barriers, and traffic circulation, right? And in response to these priorities, we handed over these concerns, right, these themes, to urban design students who developed design scenarios for the site, right? And they broke the site down into pieces, right? And they created design scenarios, which resulted in renderings, right, that they took into the neighborhood once again, right? So we went back into the neighborhood, working with our community partners, and did workshops and presented these design scenarios and got feedback on the design scenarios from local residents, right? And these workshops lasted for a week over an evening, and we did questionnaires, and so we got intensive feedback on the design scenarios that our students generated. Right? And this is where we are now. So we're now at the second vetting of design scenarios, right? And this is where the online component comes in, right? So now we're putting the design scenarios up on a website. Actually, it's being beta tested right now, with maps that sort of show that sort of put the design scenario in context. We have precedent images, that is, things that the designers were working off of, and to give the residents a chance to comment on the proposals, right? And so this is a sort of mock-up of what the comment boards will look like. So we'll have a design scenario, the precedent image will be to the right, and then we'll have comments, and we'll have moderators guiding the discussion, right? And Cynthia will speak very briefly right after me about how to design good moderation practices and how to get meaningful conversations about online, right? And the idea here, the combination of in-person and online, is meant to overcome the barriers that I identified at the outset, right? That is, so if you couldn't make it to our in-person design scenarios, our in-person workshop scenarios, or any of that stuff, right, then you can do consultations online. You can participate online. Now, yesterday we heard a bit about the digital divide, right? And we're sort of deeply aware of this problem. The average income in the borough that we're working in is sort of below the Canadian poverty line. And so what we're doing is we're sending our grad students out into the community, into various community organizations with iPads, and setting up design scenarios, design workshops with the iPads so that people can participate online, right, guided by our students, so they can walk them through the website and show them how to do this, right? So this is what we're hoping to propose to develop a worked out set of design scenarios and a worked out urban plan, development plan for the site. And we're hoping to present this to the city, and we'll present this to City Council, right? And the sort of long-term law reform objective or potential of this project, I think, is essentially twofold, right? So one way in which this project might be able to influence future developments is if it's incorporated into the practices of municipalities or developers, right? And that doesn't sound, I mean, it sounds maybe a little bit utopic, but it's not crazy, right? So that is, in Montreal, there was a development done in the Old Town in which an architecture firm did a scaled down version of what we did, right? And they have incentives to do this, right? Because if you do this, you can, by the time you get in front of planning boards or decision-making bodies, you can make the case that what you've done has involved the broader community. And in that particular case, right, the approval sailed right through. Right, so we think that there's a possibility that this will be incorporated into practices as a way of managing risk, because if you get shut down by in the final stages of the decision-making process, right, or if you get delays, that costs you a lot of money. Second possibility would be to reform the zoning processes to allow for this kind of participation and to place a burden on councils to respond to the proposals offered. Okay, so those are the two law reform possibilities, right? And as a kind of segue to Cynthia's presentation, here are just some challenges about doing stuff online of this nature, right? It's a preponderance of expert citizens, so people who really, really know this stuff, right, and are really, really engaged. So basically people in this room, right? And the question is how to get broader participation. Translating situated knowledge. So this is a problem that Cynthia talks about in her talks about in her project, right? People don't express themselves in the language of experts. They tend to express themselves in narrative and in terms of their personal experiences. So one of the challenges is to translate that kind of knowledge into the kind of things that experts, professionals, and officials can use. Questions of language, right? So, and this is tied to literacy, and there's kind of a gap between the kind of language that your average citizen uses and this language of officials and professionals, right? Citizen fatigue and cynicism, I think that speaks for itself. And there's a really big challenge about the capacity of citizens to understand the trade-offs that have to be made in complex policy environments, right? So this project tries to balance the live and the virtual in order to overcome the barriers to participation that I identified at the outset. And I'll turn now the podium over to Cynthia, who can talk a little bit more about the design of online deliberation.
Great. Thank you, Hoy. So what I'd like to do this morning is give you a very, very quick tour of the Regulation Room project. Let me start with who we are, the Cornell Rulemaking Initiative series. Multidisciplinarity is obviously the theme of the day, and we are a very cross-disciplinary group of researchers. Trying to engage citizens in learning about and effectively participating in complex policymaking, public policymaking, is a particularly challenging kind of e-government task. And we have found that bringing multiple disciplinary perspectives to bear is enormously helpful in trying to deal with some of those challenges. We have been working exclusively with federal agency partners up till now, but one of the reasons we're delighted to be partnering with Hoy and so happy to be here is that we are looking to change our focus to local governments. So we are looking for municipal partners, and hopefully we'll find some here. Over the past 6 years, we have done 5 live rulemakings with federal agencies. That's the process through which new federal regulations are made. On a sister version of our site, we have done a strategic planning exercise in health IT and a set of best practices on agencies using social media and rulemaking. If you go to our site right now, this is what you'll see, because today is the end of a 75-day comment period in which the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau has been looking for information. It's going to engage in a rulemaking, new federal regulations about consumer debt collection practices. And we have been doing public commenting on that. And as you can see, there are well over 1,100 comments. We'll probably hit the 1,200 mark before the day's over. We believe that effective design of participation processes begins with a pretty clear idea of who your target audience is. And for us, we have targeted what we call missing stakeholders. These are people who have a real personal stake in the policy decisions being made, but historically are unlikely to participate or to participate effectively in public comment processes. If you know about the federal rulemaking process, for example, the notice and comment process, that has very robust transparency and participation rights on paper formally. That process has been historically dominated by large corporations, by national trade and professional associations, by national advocacy groups. The people you don't see show up are the people that we are targeting. That is, the actual consumers who've had an experience with debt collection. The small businesses who are debt collectors, the small businesses who are creditors collecting their own debt. Those are the people that we are looking to get into the room. Our success rate Anywhere from 65 to over 98% of our registered users report this is the first time they have engaged in a discussion of this kind. The goal, as Hoy said, is really to try to get to what we call situated knowledge. And that is information and views that these kinds of stakeholders have. They're very useful to policymakers because they reveal things about impacts and enforceability and unintended consequences that these stakeholders know, or views they've developed because they are on the ground. They are existing in the complex reality that the policymaker is trying to address. The challenge in designing a participation system that can uncover this knowledge from these kinds of stakeholders is, as Hoy says, it's remediating a lot of inequalities. Effective informed participation takes a lot of skills, and this is where many of our missing stakeholders are at a disadvantage as compared with other historically much more successful participants. We focus on three main ones. The first is that typically people are unaware that these policymaking processes are going on and that they can participate. Even if they become aware, they have what we call low participation literacy. Their experience of participating in government policymaking tends to be giving an outcome preference. They vote, they fill in they sign a petition, maybe they do an opinion survey. And yet in these situations, policymakers are not usually looking for a majoritarian solution. They're looking for facts, they're looking for data, they're looking for reasons, they're looking for ways to balance competing interests. Even if people understood, though, what kind of participation is required, they have this problem that Hoy talked about with the sort of layperson expert gap. The information that policymakers generate tends to be overwhelming in its complexity, its volume, its level of sophistication. And so to get effective commenting, you need a participation system that can address all of those things. We do outreach that you won't see on the website. I don't want to really spend any time on that. We use conventional and social media. This happens to be an ad we ran in one of our last ones. I think one of the differences between a national policymaking like we're engaged in more typically and what Hoy is doing at the local level is there are much richer opportunities at the local level to reach out and bring people into the room. But whatever the media you use, the message has to be one that motivates action. And so we very much focus on how is this policymaking going to affect you? You have a right to participate. Government has a responsibility to pay attention to your participation, with the hook oftentimes that telling people, other people who have different interests are going to participate whether you do or not. So it's worth you taking the time to engage in what's a very effortful activity. Remediating low participation literacy. How do we help people move out of those commenting behaviors or those participation behaviors that aren't very effective towards more effective commenting? We use three strategies. Educational materials, probably the least useful. I'll show you in a minute where they are on the website, but you can't count on them. Mostly what we rely on, or very significantly, is what we call purposeful participation design. That is every element of the technology, the site design, the participation tools that you choose, has to be encouraging these new kinds of commenting behaviors you want people to develop. And we rely very heavily on facilitative moderation. So let's take a look at what that looks like. So when somebody comes to our site for the consumer debt protection discussion, this is the homepage. This is the educational section. Here they can find videos and also text, why you should participate, what's effective commenting, what's rulemaking, and then a discussion about the site. Here they'll find a brief summary of what's going on here, what the agency's doing, but also a little bit about what the process is. And then people basically will be able to pick the topic that interests them most. When they click on a topic, like questions about phones and mobile phone and debt discussion, this collection, you can see there's over 200 comments on this. Is a hot topic. They're presented with a number of subtopics. Again, to help them quickly identify what are the issues in this discussion. What do I want to talk about most? So let's take calls at the workplace. When they click on that, what will open is a variation on a conventional blog. Traditional blog, you have the text at the top and then people comment at the bottom. This is a side-by-side commenting format, and it encourages targeted commenting, by which we mean comments are attached to a particular section of text. They don't just float in the air. This has two benefits. It helps focus the discussion. It helps signal to people that you're engaging with a particular part of what the policymakers need you to think about, what they're concerned about, whatever. And it also organizes the information. So if I'm a new user coming to the discussion, I don't have to wade through 1,100 comments if what I'm really interested in is calls at the workplace. That information is already basically put in categories. It also helps the policymaker at the end of the day, because the policymaker can find things in the same way. But even sort of thoughtful design is not going to be enough to help a lot of new participants overcome the participation, sort of the bad participation habits or the ineffective participation habits. This is a great example of the kind of thing we often get in the first instance. This is a small debt collector who says, I think calls at the workplace should be allowed. Okay. Our moderator comes in and says, can you tell us more about when collectors should be able to call consumers at work and why? Knowing more about your reasons or personal experiences will help the agency know what things it should keep in mind if it decides to make a rule in this area. And what we see is then this commenter responding with his reasons and his own experience. Now, that may or may not persuade the agency, but that's turned a comment that they can't do much with into a comment that at least they have to pay some attention to. How do we get to the text that's on the side? This is the information overload problem. And this is one of the areas in which we mediate between the agency and the citizens. We take hundreds of pages of agency documents and we triage, we condense them, we translate them into ordinary English, and we layer information on the site so that if I'm someone that really doesn't know a lot about the basic terms, I'm going to be able to find a mouse-over glossary that gives me definitions. If I'm a real information junkie and I want to read the statute, click there and you can get the statutory text. Or click here and you can see what the agency actually said if you want to read many, many pages. What our view of this is that there is a lot of agency in both the participation designer and the citizen. The participation designer has a responsibility to design in a way that gets the kind of participation that's useful and that tries to equalize inequities. The citizen has a responsibility to decide whether this kind of participation, which is effortful, is really worth it to them. And like someone said yesterday, empowering people brings risks. Vulnerabilities, and we can talk about those in the question period if that's what you're interested in.
Hey everyone. Good morning. My name is David. I'm with the Participatory Politics Foundation, and we're a 501c3 nonprofit organization. And I'm going to show some free web tools, some of which we built and some of which just mesh up with, some of which are by other open government developers. And it meshes up with the topic of this panel on increasing citizen engagement with digital tools and free technology, and as well as how you can use our new tool, which is called Ask Them, I'll be doing a demo of it in a moment, to raise a lot of the issues that we've touched on over the conference, from municipal broadband and access to open data and more. A little bit of background first. We've been active in the open government space since 2007, and our flagship project is called opencongress.org, and that's a it's a website for tracking bills and votes in the US Congress. And I'll show you what that looks like here. We launched Open Congress because finding information about what's happening in Congress was still too difficult. The Library of Congress published bill information online, but not in a way that was really accessible and it wasn't intelligible. So you'd be able to read about news stories about a farm bill at the federal level, but you weren't necessarily sure if you were getting the whole story or weren't always able to sort of track developments with a bill. So we created Open Congress as a free resource to do that and made it possible to see not just the text of a bill, but also valuable context around it. Such as news coverage, blog coverage, and what people were saying about it in public comment forums. So Open Congress proved that there's a huge public appetite for engaging with government and the legislative process indeed, which had previously been very closed off. Since 2007, we had over 27 million web visits, 69 million page views, and we registered 300,000 people who wanted to track and share everything that was going on in Congress. And I'll show a couple of other examples of legislative participation sites in a little bit. But our new project that we just launched on February 10th is called Ask Them. It's at askthem.io. It's live now. And feel free to load it right now and take it for a spin. And we saw an opportunity in the civic engagement space for questions and answers with everyone who represents you. So for the first time on Ask Them, you can find all of your elected officials at every level of government, from federal to state to county to city, and then ask them questions and encourage a public dialogue, all from this free web resource. So Ask Them is different because it's an open source project. Our data is open. We're active in the open government data movement. And it's a nonprofit and nonpartisan project. So we contribute code and information about what people care about back to the community in the form of what user-generated questions we're finding. So again, I wanted to encourage people to head to Ask Them and raise their issues, but I'll spin through the site here. On the left-hand side, you can see top national questions that are popular with our users, and you can see that people are signing on to support questions about net neutrality, and especially about reforms of NSA domestic surveillance are proving to be popular. And in the right-hand side of the homepage, you can see examples of elected officials near you and questions to from people in your area. It works a little bit like online petitions, where you find your elected officials and ask them a question, and then questions gather signatures and up to a threshold, at which point we deliver the question to the recipient and encourage a public response. So nationwide, over 66 elected officials have signed up to respond to questions. This is a really encouraging development. We're encouraging more to sign up every day, and they are. Including here in New York, we've got 5 New York City Council members, which includes Brad Lander, who was here yesterday at the conference and who's leading the way in some participatory practices, and Manhattan Borough President Gail Brewer, who was here yesterday as well, and 3 New York Assembly members. We're having great success in other cities like Austin, where we have 5 of 7 city council members, including the mayor of Austin, Texas, signed up to respond to popular questions. And I'll show you more about how what a response looks like. But in this model, of course, we're inspired by the work of the White House with the We the People petition platform. And We the People, in a blog post from I believe it was November of 2013, said that over 10 million people have signed petitions, with over 15 million total petitions on their site. That's a growth of 360% in the 2 years that they've had the White House petition platform up. And the White House, in turn, has responded to over 200 petitions, and 66% of those polled said that this was helpful, and that 50% of signers of We the People petitions at the federal level said that they learned something new. So we believe that this open accountability and dialogue platform should exist for every elected official. So now it does. So from the homepage, if you enter, for example, I'll use the right buttons on the keyboard this time. If you enter a Philadelphia zip code, you can see questions from, go back to that. You can see questions from people in Philadelphia to their elected officials. And I'm mentioning Philadelphia because that was a pilot project, because Ask Them was developed in part with charitable support from the Knight Foundation's Tech for Engagement program. And so you can scroll down, you can see questions to federal U.S. senators, the governor of Pennsylvania, and to more local city council members. And for the first time, if you flip over to this view, you can see the federal elected officials, the state elected officials, and your municipal elected officials all in one view. So this was never possible before on an open source website. Isn't it incredible to step back and think that until we launched the site in February of this year, that this view of who represents you was not possible? That's because we've been missing a fantastic amount of data of open data about how government works and what people are interested in searching for at every level. I'm happy to talk more about that. And if you jump into someone's profile page, you can see what questions people are asking them in your community and ask them there. And I wanted to highlight this example from Councilmember Brad Lander. If you want to see how Ask Them works in action, really jump to our homepage and then find Brad Lander's page. He's a council member in Park Slope and other parts of Brooklyn. And check out the fantastic high-quality questions that are being asked of him. I really encourage you to spend some time with us because they're getting really good questions. People are raising community issues like, questions about buses, but then they're also asking questions about policy and about their libraries, about voting policies, and a lot of community issues are being raised at the local level. But Ask Them isn't just for, and then I wanted to highlight Councilmember Lander's response to a question about affordable housing in Brooklyn is a fantastic example of what a substantive policy response can look like. So on one level, Ask Them's kind of designed for light participation. Visitors hit the page and see who represents them and then sort of ask a question about an issue that they care about. We've got the opportunity from that sort of light action to really walk communities and individual users up the chain of engagement, where if they can see that they can get a response with enough signatures and enough support of a question in raising an issue that's relevant and substantive in their community, they can get a great response from a council member who is citing his reports, he's citing his work, and we're going to encourage more of this at every level of government. It doesn't just work for elected officials, it also works for anyone with a verified Twitter account. So on Ask Them, you can ask a question to MSNBC's Chris Hayes, who's agreed to participate and respond to a couple popular questions per month. And you can find others by entering your street address. There you go. Well, you can enter any verified Twitter account. And so you can see if you want to ask a question to the New York City Council, you can pull them all up. You can go ahead and ask a question to them. Will you release Vision Zero data and open standards per the mayor's recommendation? You can go ahead and select an issue and publish it, but really for individual users, they'd go through a process more like asking their own question and locating by their address. So this is our office address. By entering your address, all of your elected officials appear, including your state senators, the governor, your federal elected officials, and here to the New York City Council member, you could ask that same question. Open data now. Great. I'm going to wrap up with a few asks. The first is, if you're in touch with any elected officials who are forward-thinking on open government, encourage them to sign up with our nonprofit platform. It's free and open to everyone. The second is, please use Ask Them today and ongoing to raise your issues with your city council members. And then just drop us a note because we're always looking for examples of positive use cases to highlight for participation. Next week, my colleague Miriam and I are going to Austin, Texas to the South by Southwest conference, where we're going to be both holding question and answers with local government who signed up to respond, and also the journalist Glenn Greenwald. We're going to be having a session with him. So if you have any questions about Glenn Greenwald's NSA reporting, put them through on our platform and encourage your communities to vote them up, and we'll make sure that he sees them. And I'm interested in continuing this conversation about what sort of open data is needed in terms of elected officials who represent you at every level, what their campaign contributions are and what their public meetings are and what legislation they've taken action on, and as well as what sorts of metrics we ought to be optimizing for in creating free and open source web tools for communities. Thanks.
Hi. Thanks very much. I'm really pleased to be here. This is a great conference, and a lot of really interesting issues have been raised. I'm going to be talking about citizen engagement from the perspective of open data, and so really citizen engagement with open data. And my particular focus is on municipal transit data. I did way too many slides, so I'm going to be skipping through some of these because there's no way I have enough time to get through them all. The reason that I chose transit data as an example, there are a number of reasons why I think transit data makes a particularly good example to look at. It constitutes one of the most sought after and one of the most useful collections of municipal data sets for residents. It's been steadily evolving as well in terms of its volume, nature, and richness, and that's still an ongoing process. I'll talk a little bit about some of the different types of transit data later in the presentation. Where transit data has been made openly accessible by different municipalities, app development has prospered. So it's also a success story for open data because the data is so highly sought after. Once it's available, people are very engaged in developing apps for it. It's the opening of municipal transit data has largely been driven by local developers, engaged local developers, so it's an example of citizen engagement in that respect as well. And it's also interesting, and the particular lens through which I look at open transit data is the IP lens, or at least in this paper that I'm working on, is the lens of intellectual property. And so it's interesting for me as well because it sits at that intersection between really useful data for residents that they want to get their hands on and do things with, but it's also data which transit authorities and their private sector suppliers have seen at times as a potential revenue stream and therefore something not to be made open. So I'm going to skip through some of these. Apologies for that. Okay, so battles to control municipal transit data. Intellectual property rights, and in particular copyright, have formed a major barrier to the release of municipal transit data in the past. And intellectual property rights essentially give municipalities, and this, I think municipal transit data is a case study, but some of the lessons will apply to any kind of open data. But it is a mechanism by which data can be controlled. The rationale for that control can vary. And so sometimes the rationale for exercise of control has been that the government wants to be the sole authoritative information source. There's this fear that if the data is released and app developers are allowed to use it, they will mangle the data, distort the data, not update the data, and that citizens will get incorrect data, which could be harmful, or it could lead to them being dissatisfied with the municipal services they receive, because what might happen, for example, if incorrect data made you think your bus was supposed to arrive at 6:05 when it actually arrives at 6:10, that never happens with the official data, right? So anyway, there's also cost recovery issues. A lot of governments, not just at the municipal level, have had mandates to engage in cost recovery. And so there's also a reticence to let go of data or make open data that could potentially be used to generate revenue in some way. And so intellectual property can be a means of controlling the data for those purposes. And another factor that you've seen with municipal transit data is that many municipalities, being resource poor, have contracted with third-party suppliers, particularly for the real-time GPS data, where they get a private sector company to install the units on the individual buses and to supply the software that processes the data streams from the buses. And in many cases, or in some cases, those companies have asserted their own intellectual property rights in the data, and so that you sometimes have conflicts between the municipality and the third-party supplier over who actually has rights in that data and whether it can be made open. Another issue, of course, is where third-party suppliers, even if the municipalities have negotiated to retain any intellectual property rights in the data, the third-party supplier may use a proprietary rather than an open data feed specification, and that can also limit the usefulness or usability of the data once it's made open. So there are a number of different and interesting IP battles in relation to open data. And I'm going to very briefly, just very briefly mention, I won't get into the IP side of it. The claim for intellectual property rights in transit data are really, really weak. Okay, there's no copyright in facts. There is copyright in an original compilation of facts, an original selection or arrangement. It's not clear at all whether the selection and arrangement, for example, in a bus timetable would qualify as original. There have been arguments made by third-party suppliers that the predictions that they generate using their software with real-time GPS data are authored facts. They're not actual facts, they're predictions, and therefore there may be some intellectual property rights. I'm not sure why static transit timetables are any less fictional than predictions, but in any event, in my view, these are very, very weak intellectual property claims, but that doesn't matter. People assert really weak intellectual property claims all the time, and most developers don't have the means to challenge or resist those claims. And so copyright can be a barrier, even when it's not clear that there actually is any copyright in the underlying material. So to start, just to give you a little sense of the progression, the very first disputes arose over really basic transit data, subway schedules. Okay? Very static, very basic. But some people in their morning commutes thought, gee, wouldn't it be neat if we could get the subway schedule on our mobile device instead of having to go to a website to look it up or find it in some other way. So you had app developers who put subway schedules, they downloaded them off municipal transit websites, adapted them for mobile devices, and received cease and desist letters. And some of these were posted online. So for example, New York City sent out one in 2005. San Francisco's BART system sent one out in 2005 as well. And so the concerns raised in those letters were not revenue generation. Obviously, the transit authorities were putting these up on the website in any event. It was quality control. What if a wrong subway schedule was posted, or if it wasn't up to date? Well, you know, subway systems expand very slowly, configure. That's probably covered, but those were the reasons why these developers were told to take down their apps. That battle eventually sorting itself out. The next frontier was static transit data. This is timetable data that gets posted on printed schedules, this relic of a distant age, or on transit authority websites. This static transit data, of course, if it were available on a mobile device, would make it much easier for people to find the information they are looking for. Where that data was not made open by municipalities, and again, there was this quality control, need to control for the purposes of maintaining quality authoritative data, developers started scraping the data from websites, manually entering scheduled data, which is a joyless, painful task, or obtaining data through access to information requests. Those methods led to inaccuracies in the data, precisely those kinds of things that the transit authorities were trying to avoid. The data would have been better had they released it in open data formats. And nonetheless, you had a number of instances of cease and desist letters sent to developers who were using static transit data. Now, and again, these apps were there to help users who, in their morning commutes or evening commutes or whatever, who wanted to use the transit system, and it seemed counterintuitive for municipal authorities to be fighting to get these apps down. One thing I want to mention in particular here, New York's MTA in 2009 sent a cease and desist letter to the developer of the Station Stops iPhone app. The developer ignored the letter, and the municipality or the Metro Transit Authority got in touch with Apple and with a notice and takedown, and Apple took down the app. And so in terms of IP battles, that's just another dimension that I want to mention there, that even if the developer resists the claim of intellectual property, you may have through notice and takedown, the app being made unavailable. Again, even though there is a very, very weak claim to intellectual property rights and static transit data. Another phenomenon might be, and this is in the case of Washington, D.C., the release of poor quality data or data under completely unreasonable license terms. either demanding a license fee or requiring the developers to indemnify the transit authority if anyone is harmed by relying on faulty transit data. And so these were some of the obstructions that developers face. So where municipalities finally got on board with open data and worked with developers around open data, you saw this proliferation of apps. And so it became a very, very successful very quickly where this data was made open. I'm running out of time. I want to really mention real-time GPS transit data feeds. This is the next generation. This is really when the bus is supposed to get there, not when the schedule says it's going to get there. And I've mentioned already that that this information is also often made available through a municipality's contract with a private sector supplier, which creates that added layer of intellectual property difficulty. And of course, it also, the transit feed specifications may be proprietary, supplied by the private sector supplier, or they may be open. And so there's some really interesting debates and issues in this area, and I'm not going to have time to get into those, but I'll just flag them for you. Early providers of open real-time GPS data were Portland, San Francisco, the Chicago Transit Authority, and the Boston Transit Authority as well. And so you can see from the dates, this is all fairly recent changes and developments, but this information is now open in many municipalities, and it's an ongoing process, although there are still plenty of municipalities across the United States and Canada that do not yet make this information open. So I've mentioned the contracts with service providers. I just want to mention briefly here the example in San Francisco in 2009, where an app that displayed arrival times was derailed by the private sector suppliers' claims to exclusive rights in the real-time data generated through this system. The Municipal Transit Authority that had made the decision to make the data open to developers intervened in this case, and the data is open in San Francisco, notwithstanding this. But it is something that, of course, transit authorities have to be aware of, and it's a lesson for other types of open data, because the contracting out to private sector suppliers of a variety of different data processing services is certainly something that you see in other areas as well. Just going to mention very briefly that another wave of intellectual property claims in relation to municipal transit data relates to patent trolls that have sued many municipal transit authorities in the United States and Canada for patent infringement with respect to the real-time GPS data, and have also sued developers who, by and large, don't make much money, if any, off the apps that they've developed. And so this has become a real problem. The EFF has gotten involved, and the American Public Transit Association, in fighting these patent trolls, but that's another dimension of the IP battle in relation to municipal transit data. Just very briefly, in conclusion, the assertion of intellectual property rights has been a barrier to citizen engagement with municipal transit data. It's a battle that developers are slowly winning, perhaps winning, and have won many important battles. IP rights are a really blunt tool. They can be used by municipalities to try and protect revenue streams or control quality, but overly broad intellectual property protection or overly broad intellectual property claims can lead to the stifling of innovation and to the stifling of important uses for this type of data. And obviously, where you're dealing with municipal transit data, there are a host of important public policy issues that are raised as well. So I'll just stop there. I'm out of time. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, all of you, for these wonderful presentations and really groundbreaking projects. As I said, I'm going to open this up to the audience now very quickly, and hopefully we create a discussion between the panelists and the audience itself. Just to begin, there are just a few themes that I picked up from this, and I'm sure you have more. One, obviously, is the relationship between democratic practices and this new ideal of citizen participation through the use of new technologies. One is the question of transparency and the quality control over data. The inequalities created in informed participation and the gaps in expertise. and along with that, the inequalities in the use of these new forms of data, the actual impact of new forms of participation on policymaking, the risks involved with these expanded new forms of public dialogue and discussion, and the open data and intellectual property question that we just heard in the last presentation by Teresa. So I will open it up now, and I do believe we have folks with microphones that will help. Here we are. Okay, thank you from Nestor. And
thank you. This is incredibly interesting. And Hoy and Cynthia, I wanted to take you up on the invitation to talk a little bit more about some of the risks involved in this. So my background before I became a professor was in affordable housing and working with affordable housing providers. And my instincts from that experience are perhaps somewhat counterintuitively somewhat against public participation, mainly from constant experience with NIMBYism and often the more public a proposed development at a local level that might be an undesirable local land use like affordable housing, the more public participation tends to coalesce opposition. I worry that that phenomenon, which has always been a part of local land use, when combined with the anonymity that you can get online, may end up being a perfect storm for some of the worst instincts. And my other experience in this is that I've been following a national rule that the Department of Housing and Urban Development is proposing about fair housing and about fair housing planning. And the federal agency got about 1,000 comments. I'd say probably about 400 or 500 of those comments were really just the kinds of things you see in an unmoderated online chat room. And there were also many, many, many helpful comments. But a lot of what came out was just a very negative visceral reaction against anything related to integration or economic equality. And so I'm wondering if you could say more about how you respond to that, whether you see that. I do think it's a dynamic that's more difficult at the local level perhaps than at the national level, although it's certainly not unique. And sort of what tools, once you open participation in this way, how you respond to that?
That's a great question. We actually think that the thinking about this starts at the point before you decide to encourage online participation. Now, to some extent, at the federal level, as you know, online participation is there because regulation, those of you who aren't federal regulation junkies, there is a government-wide rulemaking portal, regulations.gov, where virtually any agency now posts their usually called a notice of proposed rulemaking, their notice that they're looking for comment. They have an obligation to accept public comment for a period of time, and anyone can go and submit a comment on this website. And it becomes part of the rulemaking record. That generally has gotten comments, very, very long, detailed, generally effective comments from sophisticated commenters who understand the process, and increasingly a number of comments from sort of ordinary citizens, which tend to be short outcome, sort of a particular outcome that we want. Sometimes are mass comment campaigns that are done by advocacy organizations where you're encouraged to file a comment that's sort of a form comment and make it, personalize it a little bit. That is totally unmoderated. There's no attempt to have people, sort of understand better what the policy is. You can go and you can look at the agency's notice of proposed rulemaking, which in our experience is 100 pages, 200 pages. The last one we did, 1,000 manuscript pages. So basically you have people who are not really getting much assistance from that website in commenting effectively. And what we do when we work with partners is the first thing we say is let's think about why you want more participation here. What are you trying to accomplish? Who are you trying to reach? What do you think those people can bring to the discussion? And then really so that, we try to be very selective about the occasions that we think government should sort of go out and look affirmatively for more participation, because we think it's a really important principle of democratic government, that a government shouldn't actively solicit participation that it's probably not going to value. And so, what we want in the first place is for government officials to really use to be thoughtful about what are you trying to accomplish here. And then you have the responsibility to provide people with the information and the kind of platform that makes it more likely that you're going to get it. That said, I think there's incredible vulnerability here. The point somebody made yesterday, you empower people and you create vulnerability. What's the vulnerability? As Hoy mentioned, it's very common for new participants to tell stories. This is the way they often engage. This is not our insight. This has been observed in many other public participation contexts. Those stories often have very personal details in them. And even when they don't have identifiable personal details in them, people have really put themselves out there in that space emotionally. And if you have an interactive forum, like a forum that encourages, a platform that encourages interactivity, what can come back can be very hurtful. This is one of the reasons why we think you have to moderate these discussions. You can't always keep the really bad stuff from happening in the first place, but you can try to control it. And we do find that our moderators have to intervene relatively frequently to sort of remind people that, that this is a place in which everybody should be able to engage in civil discussion. But that said, there is a lot of anger that's often expressed, particularly if people have been powerless. And I think there are psychic costs to this kind of participation that we can't minimize. This is not new to technology. This can happen in a public meeting. But it's also possible that technology makes it worse because people can be, they can go on at further length, they can come on multiple times and things like that. I think there's another huge risk, which is government doesn't pay any attention. You get people all motivated to participate, and they have a formal participation right, and the government formally has to account for their comments, but then government doesn't do what they want. I think there are a lot of risks that technology doesn't necessarily create, but it can amplify, and that a less than thoughtful use of technology can sort of back you into in a big way.
Other questions from the audience? I'm going to take it over here.
Hi, I have two questions, one for Cynthia and one for the panel. Before I started law teaching, I was an FCC lawyer. And we had a new FCC commissioner come in, and literally the first thing he did was to start a proceeding with respect to whether or not a tweet was a comment. And the reason he did that, he wanted to be seen as forward-thinking. He wanted to be the Internet FCC chairman. But he also was mortified because administrative law requires the agency to respond to any significant comment. So I guess, Cynthia, if you could say a little bit more about the reaction to the agencies to this process, because I suspect they're externally encouraging, but internally mortified, horrified that you just made their jobs, made rulemakings almost impossible. And then the second question is, I wonder if you all or if anybody has thought about the negative externalities associated with coalition building. In the old days, if you had a river going through your county, you thought somebody was spilling coal ash in it, you would have a meeting, then those people at that meeting would go to another meeting, and you would eventually partner with an organization that had some credibility and experience before the agency, and you would petition for rulemaking, the agency supported by this coalition. But now we're creating so many points of entry between the individual and the agency. I just wonder what effect that will have on the old way of agency advocacy. And if we're encouraging people to care a little bit about a lot of different things rather than a lot about just a few things.
Do you want people to do this?
Yes, may we start with the second question first and then open it up to our panelists who would like to respond, and then we'll move to Cynthia's response to the first. Jim?
I'll give an initial response, which is that's a good question. Briefly on our platform, gathering signatures towards a threshold indicates a level of community support, and people's online identities are tied into their verified Twitter accounts or their public social media accounts in some ways. I think your point about coalition building is interesting, and recently we've seen a good example of how this can work with the battle against the SOPA and PIPA net censorship bills. In the study by Yochai Benkler and others from Harvard that's called The Networked Public Sphere showed how coalition building can still happen with digital rights advocacy groups, with other issue-based groups forming and filtering up correct information to the media in a really interesting way. So I think it's still possible, and I think we're just at the beginning of what these tools can provide for that, but it's worth looking at how communities can effectively raise issues on platforms like ours.
And also on the coalition building point, I don't think of these processes as mutually exclusive, right? That is, it seems to me that you can have coalition building, and those who don't want to participate in a coalition can also participate individually. So I think of it as kind of a plus, that is, people have greater access, and I don't necessarily see that that detracts from the power of coalitions.
So this is another, a little bit administrative law geeky question. The short answer is that, yeah, agencies are very concerned about adding these kinds of online, participation to their official record, because then they have a judicial review may come in and say, why aren't you responding? And there's just been a report, a set of recommendations on best practices for using social media in rulemaking coming out of the Administrative Conference of the United States. And what it has said to agencies is the single most important thing you have to do is be really clear to people about what counts and what doesn't count as a comment. Because you have a lot of agencies now using blogs, right? And people can comment on their blogs about rulemaking. Or they tweet about rulemaking and people tweet back, right? And people don't understand that those comments actually aren't counting as comments, right, from the agency's perspective. And so one of the most important things I think we've finally accomplished is to say to agencies, you have to be really clear to people about what counts and what doesn't count, and what they have to do to make comments that you will consider comments that count. Then I think the question is, how does the agency make that decision? And again, I come back to, don't ask for the participation if you don't think you're going to value it, because that is not something that a democratic government should be engaged in with its citizens. We had to buy cooperation with agencies, frontline rulemakers, by agreeing that we would not submit the raw comments to regulations.gov as official comments. So we do a summary, and we post a draft summary, and we say to people, here, we've summarized, come and tell us if we've made any mistakes. And then we post the final summary. Our progression on that has been to distill less and less. Initially, we distilled a lot, and then we thought, geez, if we really believe in this idea that people have this situated knowledge that they convey through stories that can actually help the agency, and that it's better for them to participate directly than these representative organizations who really oftentimes homogenize what the interests of the people they represent are, and they don't get to that rich detail, then we have to be sharing those stories with agencies. So our summaries are really much more now about organizing the content a little more. And we've gotten very positive responses from our agency partners. A lot of times, a lot of skepticism about the rulemakers who already feel overwhelmed, but then when they read some of this stuff, they discover that they're finding out things that they don't get through the conventional process. But I think this is an ongoing part of the research, is to try to help, identify for policymakers, how you try to do these processes in ways that the volume to value ratio, right, isn't so enormous.
Yes, there was one more question here, and then we'll move to this side again. Yes, right here.
Hi, great panel. This is really inspiring stuff. I'm from Boulder, Colorado, and where we've recently had two large public debates regarding, first, the potential municipalization of the local power grid in that city, and also a large debate over bans on hydraulic fracturing in the area. And in both cases, a lot of online debate has occurred, and in many cases, the large corporate interests have paid people to post lots and lots of comments to try to sway public opinion. I was wondering if you might speak to that kind of danger with this kind of project, and what you've experienced, and what sorts of ways you've been able to combat that kind of bad user experience.
Do you have any?
Yeah, sure. So actually, I think Cynthia, you've done a great job. Part of the thing about in the rulemaking context, right, is that what's valuable is not the volume, right? So it's not a petition model, it's the reasons you give. So the fact that a corporation pays thousands of people to say the same thing doesn't really give extra weight, it's just the same comment, right? So I don't think that's, if what's guiding the regulatory regime is the reasons, right, then I don't think volume matters. But I think what you're raising is a larger question that the gentleman at the front raised, which is there are inequalities and structural inequalities that participation can't get to, right? In the case of Lulu's, right, this raises huge questions about the design of regional governance, for instance, right? And participation doesn't get at that problem. What participation can do, I think, is once the question is narrowed to the kinds of things that Cynthia's talking about, right, the actual specifics of a regulatory regime, then if you have the right moderation devices and you have the right kind of interaction, right, I think you can have a meaningful debate in which the initial sort of animosity can be sort of leveled out, and then you can actually have a conversation. But it's a risk. It's absolutely a risk.
Yeah, I think somebody made, the point yesterday that, individuals, organizations with power will sort of almost always do better in any regime. And so, you can't smooth out the inequalities completely. I think what you can do is, by how you provide the information, you can continually sort of urge people to consider the fact that there are more interests than just the ones, their own perspective. And you can try to continue to sort of point out to people that just, that what this is about is engaging with the reasons, with the conflicting interests and things like that. But at the end of the day, what we often see on our site, sort of ironically, is business being swamped by consumers, right? So you have a business commenter that will try to engage, and the consumers, it's just like a feeding frenzy, right? Because it's the first time they've really had the opportunity. And so I think volume, you're right, it doesn't matter, and yet it does matter in a context like that, right? Where people have this sense of being overwhelmingly on the other side. Moderation can help, but it's one of the risks.
Going to move here, please, this gentleman.
This is really a follow-up question, and it's inspired by some of the things that Professor Gabelli said at the big data panel yesterday, which is that if I was a banking lobbyist watching you guys on the internet, this is also a question for David as well as for this team, I think, I wouldn't think, oh, I need to get 1,000 people to send in the same comment. I would think, I need to steal your technology and build a website that invites public participation, but train my moderators to help the set of comments that I get to look different than the set of comments that you guys, you guys are so well-intentioned, it's frightening. But it seems to me that the tools you're putting in front of the world to get this process, keep this process going, are very readily adaptable to the same kind of interests you're trying. If they haven't called you yet, I would think that you're probably unviable, all of you, but there must be people who are viable for that kind of enterprise where you would not have a mass campaign to get 100,000 people to send in the same stupid comment, but a new website that was even more gorgeous than yours that would curate conversations that could then be dumped into regulations.gov, whether without the permission of the agency, too. So I don't know if part of this is a factual question. Does this happen yet?
I want to.
Are there non-well-intentioned people out there in this business? And if not, how long will it take them?
Yes, thank you for that question. It was one that I had myself. There isn't, because the presentation suggests that they are opening into a politics, but there is a politics, obviously, of these sites. And the risks involved in the politics of these sites, I think, is an important question. And also, how and who funds them and funds the research and the actual sites themselves. So thank you for that question. Teresa or David? No?
It's not really my area.
So with open source tools and with open public platforms, yes, there's absolutely always this concern. And yes, especially astroturfing, as it's known, whether it's by lobbyists or whether it's by hardcore partisans or whether it's in all sorts of communities, the term astroturfing is now more popularized because of its use in political and elections, Democrats versus Republican kind of context. The first response is that with open source and open government tools like ours, it helps that we're part of a community. We're a nonprofit project. We've known people and been active in these circles since 2007. Professor Beth Novick and work at the GovLab has touched on a lot of the interests in this panel, and those kinds of networks help keep our project on track. And what Yochai Winkler has described as a community ethos, our advisors help us with that. Generally, with other question platforms or participation platforms, Ask Them isn't the first of its kind. The online community and media site Reddit is famous for its Ask Me Anything sessions. These sorts of tools have existed in other countries and other contexts for engaging with policymaking and with submitting citizen and constituent feedback to elected officials, and they've all developed their own community norms around this. So I would say that sort of bulwark helps a lot. And in addition, there's at least there's a significant enough public demand, I think. So you used the example of a Wall Street lobbyist. I think there's a significant enough public demand now to know for hunger for data about what Goldman Sachs lobbying is, for example, on federal policymaking, that as we continually build more tools that surface more data, that liberate more data out into the open public sphere, that individual users and journalists are both going to have their eyes on that and want to make use of it in productive ways. I'm not sure if that was a great answer, but that was my best try.
I think if you can solve the problem of new technology being used in unethical and harmful ways, you will change the course of human history, right? I mean, we just had an email from an industry commenter wanting to know when we were going to post the summary of comments on this, and I'd bet my house that was because industry commenters comment on the last day or two of the comment period, and they're sitting out there and they're watching this stuff, and they want us to do their work for them, right? They want the summary so they don't have to go through the comments and then respond. There is always going to be those problems. This is an extremely effortful way for industry to try to nudge the agency or push the agency in the direction they want to go, and I think that may save us. One of the reasons why we want to do more local discussions is I think if, you may be able to build a community of informed and experienced users who begin to take on some of the tasks that the moderators now do, which are really sort of bridging between new participants in the agency, and who can take over some. I mean, we sometimes have commenters who call the moderators on things that they say, right? And that's sort of what you want, right? You want an environment in which people can call the moderators if that's what's needed. But yeah, I don't know how to prevent.
Yeah, I don't really see how you can avoid the problem of capture. I think it's the same sort of the problem, right? I think the question is, what's the baseline, right? So if the baseline is current domination by industry groups in which average citizens are completely excluded, right? Or sophisticated domination by industry groups in which citizens are at least able to offer reasoned articulation of viewpoints that decision makers have to take into consideration. I think that's a better situation than a situation in which we have complete exclusion, right? So that's just a baseline question. Second point, just on our project, my project in the local government level, and I think as Cynthia moves into that area, I think of this as a really interesting project for legal education and education generally, right? So we have all kinds of clinics in law schools. Right. This seems to me like a really neat project for a clinic, and what is sort of how I'm running it at McGill. It's an interdisciplinary project with a lot of different research assistants, some of them working in design studios, and the university is never going to be a counterbalance to really sort of powerful corporate interests. But as we've seen in the clinic example, universities can make a difference. So I think two responses, right? What's the baseline, and second, what is the responsibility and role of universities?
We have time for one more question. The gentleman here, please.
I'm Mark Abraham at Data Haven. I participate often in public forums and meetings, and I'm often frustrated by the meeting summaries and meeting minutes. What strikes me as very valuable about these sorts of technologies is the ability to archive comments over time and then refer back to them in the case of a wrongful death case or something, you could refer back to comments made many years ago about a specific piece of infrastructure, or follow sort of community comments over time. So my question is, what responsibility do the agencies and participants here have to maintain the original comments and make those accessible to the public, over an archive period, potentially decades? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a really hard question because, we feel strong responsibility as a research team to keep so we're on, this is what you saw was design 6 of our site. We've done 6 major discussions. We've at least tweaked, and this time more than tweaked each time. And we keep an archive, right, of our designs, and so you can go, you can see the comments, things like that. How long will that last? I don't know. How long will we have funding? The agencies, if they actually become part of the public comment record, the agencies must keep them in their federal archiving rules, right? And so our summaries, right, are going to be part of those records. But no, I think that's a real problem. It's a problem that generally, right, exists on the net when, important websites disappear. And so I don't have any really much to say beyond that.
I think it's often tough to make the old relevant information accessible, but in terms of with open source websites and open government websites and open data projects, there's a pretty good consensus right now about how the technical aspect of that works. Most of my colleagues, we host our sites in the cloud on Amazon. We manage open source development of our sites using a platform called GitHub, and that makes the archives viewable and queryable. And as much as possible, we make our data open to the community in the public commons. So at least we're doing a pretty good job of preserving it. But that doesn't mean we're not government entities. We're not the primary publishers of data. We're just hosting the social layer in some ways.
There's one quick question here that I did not see before. If you could just be patient with us just for a moment. Yes.
My question is primarily directed to Mr. Kong. In connection with sending the students in to do sort of the what would the community like, when do budgetary and other fiscal constraints enter the picture? Because do you not run the risk of kind of raising expectations only that down the line, whether it's the municipality or whoever the funding source is, says no can do? So I'm wondering when that real practical and fiscal constraint comes into the planning.
Right. So this is another opportunity for me to say thank you, Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, who's funding the project. So I guess I have 2 possible responses. Right. One is that if you have the kind of funding sources that Cynthia and I have, the sort of research funding, we're dependent on the research councils that fund us, right? And so I guess, the response is the concern about raising expectations is to say, this is funded, it's short term, we can't guarantee it.
That's really the actual fiscal constraints for the project. In other words, what kind of development do you want in this neighborhood, and getting that feedback. But if there's only X number of dollars to actually build that project.
Gotcha, right, yeah, okay, right. So that's really good question. I think the response is to say, look, we're offering reasonable proposals, right? And we're hoping that what comes out of the planning out of our consultations is that we're not going to build beyond what any developer would take on, right? And part of that is limited by the actual land use regulations that we have, right? In the Montreal case, actually, there is a lot of there's sort of set-asides for, to go back to the earlier question, affordable housing, right? But those set-asides are built into the legislation on the assumption that this is affordable and not impossible. But I guess at the end stage of the process, when it actually goes to council and we get down to the nitty-gritty, questions of cost will arise. Yeah, but it's a great question. Thank you.
Thank you very much to our panelists for this excellent discussion. And I believe we have a coffee break.